Again, welcome to the Miqra, Shabbat Shalom, and Hag Sameach. Hag Sameach. We're rejoicing in the things that Father has done for us. Way back in Egypt, when we were there and we were slaves to Pharaoh, and He came to our rescue. And He delivered us from that bondage by displaying His mighty power in overcoming Pharaoh's dictates and the gods that Pharaoh and the rest of the Egyptians served. Father proved Himself greater than all of the other gods. That there is no one like Him. And so He's done that for His people. Like we talked about last night, He makes a distinction between His people and the people of the world. And that distinction is supposed to show up in our lives. We're supposed to inherit that distinction. We're supposed to embrace that distinction and walk in it. Meaning that we walk in His ways and not the old ways of the world. The ways of darkness, the ways of satisfying the flesh instead of without satisfaction. Because you never satisfy the flesh. You keep trying and trying and trying in the old way. And it only lasts for a moment, that satisfaction, and then you're searching again for something deeper and greater in your life. But with the Father and with His Spirit abiding within us, He gives us that everlasting, ongoing, permanent joy and shalom, and that satisfaction. And so the joy He gives us is joy indeed, and it's a complete joy. And it's lasting. Hallelujah. And we bless you, the Father, for that. We are grateful for what He is doing in us, His plans for us. He predestined us to become sons and daughters. And He's working in each one of us that work that He began in us. And He's going to bring that work to a completion in us. And the work that He's doing in us is not always an easy work. It's a work of endurance and perseverance in the things that come our way, because we have to endure like our Master, the Messiah, endured. You know, He was faced with temptations in the desert. He was faced with the temptations of the religious leader of His time, always coming at Him and challenging Him. And really, at some point, they wanted to kill Him because He was a rebuke to them, because He was walking in the Father's love and in His Father's commandments and not submitting to the authority and the commandments of men. And so we can expect that in our life as the Father brings what He began in us to completion. We're going to face all of those things. But no temptation is taking you, but as is such to man, common to man. Elohim will provide a way of escape that we may be able to bear those things that come our way. And so never give up, never give in to the devil, and never go back to the ways of the world. Let's continue forward in progress toward the goal of our faithfulness in Him, which is to see that resurrection day and to be inheriting the kingdom which He has promised to those who love Him. Hallelujah. Lessons from the unleavened bread. Last night we talked about Pesach, and we talked about the redemptions and the deliverances of Yahweh by His powerful arm to us when we were in Egypt, and then to us again when Messiah came. And He provided a deliverance and a redemption on our behalf. And a substitution, as the Isaiah 53 describes, that He was wounded for our transgressions. And so He became an atoning sacrifice in our place. And we have that perfect atonement through our Messiah that we cling to. And when He went up to the Father, then He took on the role of high priest, and He intercedes on our behalf to the Father. He's always there, making the connection for us because of the blood He shed with the Father, so that we can continue even when we slip up. And of course, we should never intentionally sin and transgress His law, but when we slip up, He has provided an atonement, and we need to go before the Father and confess our sin and repent and turn away from what we did, and He receives us because of the blood of the Messiah. So we learned a lot of lessons last night about that, about the atonement, about the deliverance of Yahweh. And today we're going to just look at the unleavened bread, because today is the first day of the pilgrimage feast of unleavened bread. And we're going to look at this topic of on the transformation of the believer's life, because the redemption, the shed blood of the Lamb, is supposed to stir up within us a desire to please the Almighty, and it should result in our lives in a transformation of our life, a renewing of our mind, a renewing of the way we see things and think about things, so that the ways of the world are no longer appealing to us. And we don't want to go back that way, because we've been there and we know it's all a dead end. It all results in misery and pain, even though for a while indulging can sometimes be pleasurable. In the end, it results in misery and ultimately death. So the believer's life should be transformed, and not just believing in Jesus and asking Him into your heart, and then believing that all is well now and I can go and live my life the way I want to. But the Messiah died for us not so we can go back into the old way, but so that we can live in a new way, in the way that He described for us and taught His disciples and lived out Himself. And so this is the way of the walk of faithfulness that we are describing. So let's look at the instructions for the first Passover from Exodus chapter 12. That's Shemot. Remember, the Hebrew name of the book is Shemot, meaning names. These are the names of the sons of Israel that came into Egypt, and then the names are listed there right at the beginning of the book of Exodus. But in Exodus chapter 12, it says, this is a day, and we're talking about today now. This is the 15th day of the first month of the Hebrew and biblical calendar. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a pilgrimage festival to Yahweh, a lasting ordinance. That means it's a permanent thing. And every year and in every generation of people who are serving the Almighty, we are to observe this festival at its appointed day and commemorate those things that happened on our behalf, the work of the Almighty. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the seventh must be cut off from Israel. And so this is an instruction that sometimes we overlook, and we try to, where it says, on the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. And we've gotten into a habit or a tradition or a custom or whatever of the day before the feast, the pilgrimage feast of unleavened bread. We go in and we clean out the cupboards and sweep the floors and make sure we don't have any yeast products, in our cupboards, and we either throw them out, or some people put them in the garage or whatever, out of the house or whatever. We do those things that we feel necessary to remove those things from our houses, but we do it on the day before or on the days before, and that's kind of become a custom. But the instruction of Scripture is actually to do it on the first day. It's okay if you haven't done it, when the sun goes down on the 15th, moving into the 15th day. But on that first day, we remove the leaven out of our houses. Let me say this also about removing the leaven. Those who are zealous among us and among other groups and congregations, and really the tradition of the Jews is to be real meticulous in going through the cupboards and sweeping up every last crumb to make sure there's no leavened product or any type of leavened thing anywhere in the house. And so I think that's where the idea of spring cleaning came from. It's from cleaning out the house, right? Sweeping up and vacuuming and all the things we need to do to get every last bit of dust and so forth. But really, the intention of the commandment is actually much simpler than that. And I'd like to at least express my opinion on this, and you can size it up for what it's worth, okay? I think that the instruction is not about going through your wine bottles and seeing if that wine was made with yeast, or all of those meticulous little things. I think it's so simple that he just wants us to get the leaven out, the leavened bread. It's the bread he's concerned about. That's the object lesson for us. And so when we get the leavened bread and the little dough batch that we produce leavened bread from, because a little leaven leavens the whole lump. When we get rid of that, we can start a new lump at the end, and after the festival is over, after the 7 days are over. It's really a very simple thing to produce a new batch of a leavening agent. But the object lesson is about getting the leaven out, the leavened bread. And so I think if we simply just do that, if we just get the leavened bread and eat unleavened bread for the 7 days, we have satisfied, I think, the intention of this commandment. Because Yahweh doesn't want things to be complex. Man-made religion wants to make everything complex for us. They want to make the Sabbath day, with 1,000 different rules about what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, and all the rest of the laws. They multiply instructions and commandments and requirements, and it becomes a heavy burden that no one can bear. Father's ways are simpler than that. He has a mind for our good, and he wants us to be able to do those things, comply with his instructions, so that we see the deeper meaning of the pictures and of the instructions and commandments that he gives us. Because they're always, again, for our good. He intends them to be for our good. Continuing on in Exodus chapter 12, on the first day hold a set-apart assembly, and that word there in Exodus 12 is Miqra Kodesh. We see the same word, Miqra Kodesh, in Leviticus 23, and we've gone through Leviticus 23 in quite some detail in the past about the Miqra Kodesh and what we are, why we call ourselves the Miqra. Because we're here in a sacred, a set-apart Kodesh, a set-apart assembly for the purpose of meeting the Almighty on his appointed days, the seventh-day Sabbath, and then the annual appointed days according to the calendar that he's given to us. So on the first day, hold a set-apart assembly, and that's what we're holding right now. And another one on the seventh day. Do no work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. Now on a regular seventh-day Sabbath, it's my understanding and interpretation that even preparing food is not to be done on the seventh-day Sabbath. And the example of that was pretty clear from in the desert, in the manna. The sons of Israel were to collect the manna each morning for that day, but on the sixth day they were to gather enough for 2 days so that they didn't have to go out on the seventh day. So that food would already be gathered and it would be prepared so they can just eat it on the seventh day. And I think that's the example we're given that shows us that food preparation is not acceptable, or it's not his intention for us. Let me put it that way without banging the drum. He wants us to have a full and complete rest and to dedicate ourselves and our time on the seventh day to him and to him alone. But there is an exception on the first and seventh day of the pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread. No work is to be done like on any other Sabbath, but you may prepare food. And I suspect that this is because when we sacrifice the Passover the day before, it's going to be cooking on into the night. And so we don't stop cooking it because the sun went down and the first day of the feast came. We continue to cook it. I mean, we're preparing that as something that we're going to eat. At least the ancients did it this way. And so the exception to the rule is for the first and the seventh day. And so I want to tease you a little bit about next Friday, because next Friday is the seventh day of the pilgrimage feast, the last day of unleavened bread. And we're going to look at why the seventh day is also to be a set-apart assembly and a sacred day. And it's something that I've never understood. I didn't understand what happened in the past that celebrating the seventh day looks back toward. And I didn't understand what it looks forward to prophetically. But the Father gave me some insights this week, and that's what I'm going to tease you with. You have to come next Friday on the set-apart day for assembly, and that's going to be the teaching for the day. I'm going to talk about the seventh day. Hallelujah. So celebrate the pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Mitzrayim. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. And now I am going to beat a drum here, and I'm going to just repeat what we talked about when we had to study last week about the instructions of Passover and the actual events of the 14th and the 15th, how that all went down. Because the instruction was to sacrifice the Passover lamb that they had chosen on the 10th day, on the 14th day between the evenings, which I believe means from the beginning of the going down of the sun in the middle of the sky to the setting of the sun below the horizon. So during that second half of the daylight hours of the 14th day of the month, the Passover was sacrificed, and then the people were to roast those lambs and eat them, once they were completely cooked, which would be later on in the evening or night. So what we learned about that in the instructions was they were to take the blood of that lamb that they had slaughtered between the evenings, and they were to sprinkle that blood on the doorposts and on the lintel of their homes. And that night, as the death angel came through, Yahweh would see the blood, and the death angel would miss that house, and the firstborn of that house would be saved. When all the firstborn of Egypt were slaughtered that night by the death angel, Pharaoh in the middle of the night, he himself, his firstborn son was dead, and he had had enough of Moshe and of his demands, and he said, get out of my country, you and all your people. So the people were keeping vigil that night, and they were preparing themselves to march. And at daylight, they began to march out of Egypt. And so the commemoration is about the rescue and deliverance of them from Egypt. And it occurred on the morning of the 15th day of the month. That was when they began to line up, and I guess they were in some sort of rank formation, formation where they could march in some orderly fashion out of Egypt. So this is the day, the 15th day of the month is the day that we're to commemorate, because this is the day that he rescued us and our ancestors out of Egypt. He says furthermore, as we continue on in Exodus chapter 12, in the first month you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. Let me stop right there and explain a little bit of confusion that happens from this statement. This statement about the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. Now we know from the book of Genesis and the creation week and from other sources that a day is reckoned as the approximately 24-hour period beginning with the dark period and then the light period of the day. So a day, by Hebrew reckoning, was a night and a day. And so where it says the evening of the 14th day, people get tripped up on this and they think that it's the beginning part of the 14th day when we're to eat bread made without yeast. And yet that conflicts with other instructions which tell us it's from the 15th day through the 21st day that unleavened bread is to be eaten. So what's meant here is not that on the 14th day we're to begin eating the unleavened bread, but the evening of the 14th day means the evening that follows the 14th day, as the sun sets, and that's the evening when the sun's going down. Because remember, I explained that the word evening means a going down. The going down of the sun, beginning at the midpoint of the day, in the middle of the sky, and the going down at sunset. And so the evening of the 14th day is that point in time when, as the 14th day is coming to a close and the sun's going down, that's the evening of the 14th day being referred to in this verse. When we have that understanding, then it doesn't conflict with the other instructions about the 15th through the 21st, which is clearly the instruction about eating the unleavened bread and when the feast of unleavened bread occurs. Okay? So that's just a point that trips a lot of people up, this understanding of what this phrase means. So I hope that's clear and you can receive that. For 7 days, no yeast is to be found in your houses. And for anyone, whoever eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is an alien or native born. And the idea, again, here is bread or food made with yeast. It's about eating the yeast. It's not supposed to be in your homes. In other words, it's not supposed to be in your cupboard, made available so that you can cook your foods or your breads with the yeast. So you're to get rid of that lump of dough, which is the starter, or some people call it the mother, right? And then whoever eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off. And the reason for that is because Father wants us to really maintain this picture for ourselves, this type, in order that we might understand the deeper and spiritual meaning of the unleavened bread. So if we're not complying with this instruction, and we're eating leavened bread anyway, then we're not really on board with the Father, and we're not really in agreement with the Father. And whenever that condition occurs, we've cut ourselves off from the Father. When we're no longer in agreement with Him, when we're no longer saying yes, but are intentionally working against His known ways, then that cuts off our relationship with Him. That has to be restored and fixed before we can receive the blessings from Him again. So it seems kind of harsh and severe that anyone eating leavened bread during these 7 days are going to be cut off. But the severity is on account of the importance of maintaining that relationship with the Almighty and maintaining the object lesson and the picture that He's provided for His people. So eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. The circumstance of eating unleavened bread, because they didn't have time for bread to rise, occasioned a spiritual lesson. Let me just back up for a second there. The account of the story tells us it's because they were in such a hurry to get out of Egypt, and get on the road, that they didn't even have time to put the leaven in their bread and wait for that leaven to raise the bread up. They just didn't have time for that. They were throwing everything together, packing their wagons and their donkeys, and they were on their way first thing in the morning. And so they didn't have time for the bread to rise. But the circumstance, as I'm trying to explain here, occasioned a spiritual lesson. In other words, the Father had something more in mind than just, eating unleavened bread. It was to be an object lesson for the sons of Israel, the eating of the unleavened bread. Israel came out of Egypt, and Egypt also needed to come out of Israel.
Amen.
This is the object lesson, as I'm putting it in a nutshell, in my own words, in my own way, is yes, they came out of Egypt. But if they carried with them on the journey the worship of idols and foreign gods, and they carried the traditions, and if they carried and brought with them the mindset and all the mentality of being a slave and being required to worship the gods of the Egyptians, then they missed the whole point of the unleavened bread. Because the unleavened bread was intended by the Father to illuminate our thinking into understanding that, it was more than just the bread. And the object lesson was to remind us over and over again that we are to get rid of all the false worship of the past. That's leavening in our lives, the false worship. It's what poisons our spirit. Our old habits, the old habits of satisfying the flesh. A slave mentality. We're no longer slaves to the world. We're no longer slaves to the gods of this world. And we have to recognize and realize that. We have committed ourselves to the true master of heaven and earth. And we become servants of his. And now, because we're bought at a price, we should be serving him and not serving any other gods or any other ways or traditions or customs. Fear, unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment, all of these things that built up in us because we didn't walk in the Father's ways in the past are things that we need to cast out of our lives. These things don't always occur instantaneously when we come into repentance to the Father and he receives us as sons and daughters. Sometimes these things are deep down, and sometimes they come from our experiences in the past and influences that made a difference in our lives and formulated the way that we think and live. Sometimes they can come from parents or friends or other relatives. Fear, unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment. These are things that we have to identify in our own lives and then cast those things out. And allow, because with the Father there is no fear except a fear of him. Fear doesn't come from the Father. Neither do these other things. Unforgiveness comes from stubbornness. Resentment and bitterness, they come from pride, really, pride. And so these are some of the things that the unleavened bread represents for us on a spiritual level. Attitudes of the mind, unhealthy spiritual agreements, things that we've made oaths about. We've committed ourselves to a course of serving something other than the Almighty. We need to go back. Paul talked about people are sick and dying on account of eating of the body and blood of Messiah in an unworthy manner. And that would include continuing on in a sinful habit or practice, or hanging on to those resentments and bitternesses and unforgivenesses that we have toward people, because the Father freely forgave us. And we are supposed to be responding to the Father and to become like him, such that we forgive others. Because didn't the Messiah say that if you don't forgive others, neither will your Father in heaven forgive you your trespasses? So we have to release those things, and that's all part of what the unleavened bread means. We have to give those things up, recognize them, confess them, and cast them off. Repent from those things, and receive a renewing of the mind, and allow the Spirit to work in us to make us the people that Elohim intended us and purposed us to be. So again, what does the leaven mean? And we're going to look back at a few of the things that Messiah Yahushua taught his disciples. This one out of Matthew chapter 16, verses 5 through 8. It says, when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Yahushua said to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they discussed this among themselves and said, is it because we didn't bring any bread? And aware of their discussion, Yahushua asked, you of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? So it wasn't about the bread. The Messiah was able to produce bread for his disciples. It wasn't a matter of lack of resources for food. But here's what he says about what he stated about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? Again, the Messiah talked in parables. And we need to understand much of the teachings of the Messiah as not sometimes literal, but sometimes parable, figure of speech, representations of things. And so we have to use the mind of the Spirit to get to the bottom of what he's teaching so that we don't misunderstand him, like the people who went away because they thought he was telling them to gnaw on my arm and then I'll cut myself and you can drink my blood. That's not what he was saying. It was figure of speech. So he says, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so the leaven sometimes represents teachings, the teachings of the religions that we came out of, in the institutions made up by man's decrees and laws and traditions, wherein that religious system is based upon the commandments of men and not the instructions of the Father. So we're supposed to be aware of those things. We're supposed to be aware that other religions that don't promote obeying the Father and his instructions ultimately are telling us to obey some other man-made instruction, and that's leaven in our lives. That's going to distance us from the Father because we can't come fully into the Father's presence and do all that pleases him if we're engaging in the activities that we were taught through the commandments of men, that leaven which poisons our spirit. And so the leaven here is the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And we've all come out of places where the teaching wasn't always right on to what the Bible shows us. And as we diligently search the Scriptures and have a heart to understand what the Father really is teaching us, we will dig in deep and we will search and ask the Father to give us understanding, and he will give us understanding about what he wants us to do so that we can overcome all of the doctrine and all the lies that have been inherited into our lives, and the things that we have practiced unwittingly, thinking that we're serving God, but we weren't serving God in those ways. We were actually serving something else, some other God. And so the teachings of religious institutions are something that the Master told us to be aware of, to beware of. And so that's the approach we need to take in going back and looking at the doctrines that have been taught us. We need to be aware of those teachings and examine those teachings. Compare them. I've said 1,000 times, be like the Bereans and go back and find out if the teaching of this individual lines up with what the Scriptures teach. And if it doesn't, discard it. It may be 80% truth, what somebody's teaching, but if it's 20% in error, it's poison to our spirit. And we need to discard that and come into an understanding that is 100%, as much as it is possible with us, as we listen to the Holy Spirit 100% in compliance with the meaning and intention of His Word. Leaven equals teaching. The disciples, this is Mark's account, it reads just a tiny bit differently. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Yahushua warned them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Now Herod was another religious system in that day. The followers were smaller in number. The Pharisees and Sadducees were the big groups. But the Herodians were another group that had their own religious establishment and way. And then there were Essenes, and I suppose there might have been other groups as well. The Zealots, I don't know where the Zealots fell and all of that. But there were other, just as there are today. We have thousands of denominations, right? Everybody has a different way of interpreting the scriptures and of teaching doctrine. So watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. And aware of their discussion, Yahushua asked them, why are you still talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? And that's what happens to us when we don't recognize the parabolic nature of the teaching of the Messiah. We harden our hearts because we think He's saying one thing, and He's not saying that at all. It's an illustration or a picture or something to get us thinking so that we come into the true understanding of the message He's bringing to His disciples. Luke says something else about leaven. In Luke chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, it says, meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Yahushua began to speak first to His disciples, saying, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. And so now here, Yahushua names, this is a different occasion. He names what He means by the yeast of the Pharisees. It's hypocrisy. And we know from, some accounts in Matthew that this is exactly what the Pharisees lived by, their hypocrisy. They were play actors. He called them hypocrites because they were acting out something that wasn't true or real in their lives as a means of putting on display, a holiness that wasn't a true holiness in their life. So there's nothing that is concealed that will not be disclosed or hidden that will not be made known. So the warning here is against hypocrisy. It's against living in a way that where you know a truth and you're not living by that truth, but you're living in another way. Or better yet, you're living by a lie and you're pretending to be walking in the truth. So there's the hypocrisy. You can teach sound doctrine, but not actually in your private life, when people aren't looking at you, living a different way and walking in a different manner. That's hypocrisy, and that was characteristic of the Pharisees, who were just religious play actors. So the yeast or the leaven being spoken of in the pilgrimage feast of unleavened bread is supposed to remind us on a spiritual level that we're not supposed to be hypocrites in our walk. We're supposed to be genuine and walk in a genuine way before the Father, behind closed doors and out in the public. We're supposed to be the same person wherever we are, whether eyes are on us or eyes are not on us. Paul has this to say about leaven: when you are assembled in the name of our Master Yahushua, and I am with you in spirit, and the power of our Master Yahushua is present, hand this man over to Satan so that the sinful nature may be destroyed and his spirit saved on the day of Yahuwah. And so we've talked about this occasion in the past as well. It was when a man was involved in open rebellion against the Almighty by taking on the wife of his father as a marriage partner. And so this open rebellion against the Almighty, which is spoken of in the book of Leviticus, it gives us very clear instructions about holiness and set-apartness. And some of those instructions include certain relationships, personal relationships, intimate, physical relationships that are against the Almighty's will for our lives. And so he tells us not to do this, not to marry this person and this relative and that relative and so forth. So this individual was in open rebellion and just displaying this in front of the assembly, and Paul says, you gotta do something about this, because you're boasting. They were boasting about this man who was displaying, that he was married to this woman. And it was clearly sinful. They were boasting about it. Your boasting is not good, Paul says. Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? And there's the object lesson again from the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's about the dough. The dough has a characteristic whereby when you put that yeast dough into the flour and you let it set, everybody who cooks in this room and who are listening know that that's what you do. You put the yeast in the dough, it rises, and then you bake it, and then it's puffy, it's lighter, it's easier to eat. So that's the nature of yeast. But on a spiritual level, yeast works in the same way. It gets in people's beings, and it puffs them up to the point where they're so proud, they boast about their sin and about their evil ways, and no one's doing anything about it. The assembly's remaining silent about it, and the assembly's, some of them are looking at this and saying, well, the leader's not doing anything about it, so maybe it's okay. So maybe we can do these things too. We can get away with sin and even boast about it, and nobody's going to challenge us on this. That's why it's important that we rebuke our neighbor frankly, because we want to save him from the end result of their transgression. Save a life is what we're doing when we confront in the proper way and at the proper time. We confront the sin in a brother's life, especially the elders should be rebuking open rebellion, things that are known throughout the assembly that are wrong, and so the elders are supposed to be leaders in that thing of confronting it. Otherwise, the whole congregation will have a mindset of it's okay to sin now, and the Almighty doesn't care either. It's okay. Jesus died for all my sins, past, present, future, and so it doesn't matter if I sin, because it's already been covered by the blood. Well, that's not the way the Almighty looks at it. The Almighty looks at the offering of His own Son to die a hideous death on the tree as something that ought to get our attention and ought to transform our lives and change the way we think and live.
Hallelujah.
And so that's what the leaven is all about here. Paul says further, get rid of the old yeast. And this is just something that they did by practice. But again, it has a spiritual application. Get rid of the old yeast that you may be a new batch without yeast, as you really are, for Messiah, our Pesach lamb, has been sacrificed. And so getting the old yeast out means getting rid of, again, as I've already talked about at length, getting rid of the old practices and that old mindset and all the things that we brought with us out of Egypt, or the things that we brought with us out of the world into the world we're living in right now.
Amen.
We need to get rid of all of it, because none of it has a place in the life of a believer who's serving the living Elohim. And therefore, Paul says this, let us keep the festival. Obviously and clearly a statement in the New Testament that tells believers that we're supposed to be guarding this pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread. And so when people say that those things were done away with, it conflicts with and contradicts some very clear statements in the New Testament, this one by Paul, who tells us to keep the festival, guard the festival. That was the commandment from Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. guard the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with the bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. And so again, this is the difference between the old bread made with the old yeast and the new bread. It's the difference between hypocrisy and honesty and truthfulness. It's the difference between malice and wickedness and sincerity and truth. So these are the ways that we're to walk in, and this is what the object lesson is all about. And every year we practice this, and every year we should be reminded, even as we practice these things, even as we eat the unleavened bread, that this is what the Father has for us and wants us to walk in, this transformation of our thinking and of our life. I have written you in my letter, Paul said, not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral or the greedy or swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you have to leave this world. But now I am writing you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or a slanderer, a drunkard or a swindler, which such a man do not even eat. And so here's that separation we talk about when we consider the commandment that Father gave us to be holy as I am holy. We're to separate as he has separated himself and has demonstrated through the works of creation and in many other ways. He separates himself from that which is evil and sin. And he's calling us to separate ourselves from those things that are primary in the life of one who doesn't trust in Elohim. Greedy people, idolaters, slanderers, and so forth. So what business is it of mine, Paul says, to judge those outside the assembly? Are you not to judge those inside? Elohim will judge those outside. The judgment of the unbeliever is left up to Elohim. We don't have to judge them.
Amen.
But we are to expel the wicked man from among you.
Amen.
That's a requirement. That is a responsibility that we're given in order that the body of Messiah and the assembly that we meet in is not poisoned by open rebellion.
Amen.
A couple more verses, and then I'll bring this study to a close. Getting rid of the old leaven, and the whole the day that we're commemorating, the 15th day of the first month, was a day when Yahweh set his people free. That's why we're to commemorate it, because we marched away from slavery. And we marched away from the old system of Egypt. And when we lived in Egypt, we walked in the ways of Egypt. We were, in the least, we were influenced by the influences of Egypt, their gods and their practices. We had to do what Pharaoh told us to do, or we were going to be beaten. And if the beatings didn't change our mind about serving Pharaoh and doing what he said, then we'd end up dead. And so there wasn't much choice in the life in Egypt. And, we had to serve Pharaoh. But when we came out of Egypt, we were set free from that kind of man-made control and that kind of bondage. And we were set free to serve the living Elohim.
Hallelujah.
And this is what the true biblical freedom is all about. It's not about the freedom to do anything we want to do. It's about the freedom that we have from the bondages which held us down. The freedom to be able to serve Elohim the way that he has called us to serve him. And that freedom is a joyous thing. To be able to serve the Almighty is a thing that brings pleasure to those who love him. Because we see the results of his commandments, and we know that those things are good for us. So the book of Isaiah, and this is a passage in chapter 61 that the Messiah himself quoted when he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath in Nazareth. And he read this. He said, the Spirit of Adonai, the Lord, or Master Yahweh, is on me, because Yahweh has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives. And that's the emphasis I'm making here. Freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor and the day of vengeance of our Elohim. So the prophet was describing here a time when Father would set his people free in these various ways, that they would be benefited in their relationship with the Almighty. And one of those benefits is freedom from captivity. That could be freedom from the dungeon, like we read about Yosef. Yosef was thrown into the dungeon and was a prisoner. And he was set free because Yahweh's favor was upon him. And he pleased Yahweh in every way and continued to maintain faithfulness to the Almighty, even in those dire circumstances of seeing very little hope of ever getting out of that prison. The Almighty arranged a way that Pharaoh would be pleased with Joseph and would release him and elevate him to a position of responsibility and governorship over the whole land of Egypt. So freedom from captivity can also take the form of those things which captivate us. In other words, going back to the doctrines and the traditions and the teachings that we were required to do under a certain religious system, any of the religious systems that people come out of, whether they're Christian-based or Jewish-based or Eastern religion-based, all of those have those elements of captivity that we're required to meet the demands of our denomination. I mean, there probably are very few of us in this room who have been in a congregation where you were required to come into agreement with the pastor, and you were required to agree with the doctrines. And in some churches, you even, to become a member, you had to sign a statement that you agreed with these certain set of doctrines. And so there's a certain amount of captivity in that, because now you're required, and you've taken an oath by signing it, that you're going to submit to whatever that is. Even if you come into a disagreement, you're required to, maintaining your fellowship there, to submit to those ways. And sometimes we refuse to do that, and we get the boot. And that's okay, because that, when we come into truth, we have to walk in the truth, even if it costs us. So freedom for the captives, and this is what the Messiah came to do for us. His death on the tree provided that freedom, that release for us to serve Elohim in a new and a living way. The book of Hebrews puts it that way. And then Paul says in Romans, the creation was subjected to frustration. Romans chapter 8, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of Elohim. And so what Paul is suggesting is that the children of Elohim have already been set free. It's a glorious freedom, and that the rest of creation is waiting to be able to join the children of Elohim in that freedom, because the creation's still in bondage because of sinful man, and because most of the inhabitants of the earth are still walking in sin. They're not resting in the land, they're not obeying the commandments, they're not doing right by their brother, and so forth and so on. And so the creation is waiting for that day when they can be released from that decay into the freedom that the children of Elohim are experiencing in their relationship with the Almighty. So we know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. So there, again, Paul is suggesting this freedom that we're walking in is a glorious freedom. It's a freedom that enables us to serve the living Elohim. And we're no longer required or stuck in a place where we have to submit to some other way, to some other lifestyle, to some other religious practice. And then here's my final slide, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion, because I know there should be lots of questions and comments about this freedom that we have in Messiah. So let me just cover this last one, and it's from the fourth gospel, the book of Lazarus, chapter 8. It says, to the Yehudim who had believed him, Yahushua the Messiah said, if you hold to my teaching, you really are my disciples. And then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be free? And Yahushua replied, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. The word indeed there, I put a little note, it means pertaining to something that is actually so. It's a reality. It's a truth. It's something in certainty. In other words, it's not just theoretical in nature, but the freedom that we experience in the Messiah is a real freedom. It's a freedom from being slaves to sin and all the things that bring about sin in our lives. You know, again, as we submit to other religious ways, we become slaves to those religious ways, and we are in bondage to those religious ways. But the Messiah came to set us free from those things, so we can walk in freedom. And this is what Unleavened Bread is all about. It's the object lesson on a spiritual level, that we can be free, and we should be walking in freedom. The freedom from all of the things that so easily beset us, as Paul said in one place, the things that have captured and captivated us and held us prison. And we can walk in the true, real, actual freedom that Messiah provides by being free to please the Father in every way. So I hope this shorter than usual lesson that I'm bringing today has been a benefit and a help to our understanding of why we're eating unleavened bread this week. Hallelujah. So what say you?